They answer, and he says, I don't know you. I don't recognize your voice. That's a little bit terrifying.
For me, the sort of darkest word in this whole rejection in Matthew 7 is never. I never knew you. While you were casting out devils, while you were prophesying in the name of Jesus, while you were doing many wonderful works, I did not know you even then. I don't know where we end up with this.
I know in our day and age, we don't like to be called out or to think that Jesus isn't always just there to just love and accept us and welcome us home. There's also this side where there are certain expectations. This doesn't diminish his grace or his mercy at all. It's just saying you have to be prepared to enter here. And if you don't know me on a real level, you are not prepared. There's something going on here with recognizing Christ and him recognizing us.
What would happen after that happened? Like once they were denied at the door, what would happen to them?
Great questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, as some of you very well know, Hayden and I are very long and far away from the studio, so we finally have stopped gatekeeping the best part of the Paul family. Well, one of the best. It's our little sister Ella, who just got back recently from her mission. We tagged her in for an amazing episode this week with Andrea Woodmansee
and Dave Butler.
So
They haven't done anything together, and so you get the double whammy. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's gonna be awesome.
So Andrea, if you guys have watched her videos in the past, you know that she is a wealth of knowledge, has some amazing things to share. She actually is writing a book right now that is going to be published by our publishing company. And if you want to be the first person to be notified when this book comes out, which is going to be in the coming months, then link in the description, sign up, give your email, and you will be among the first people to know, and you'll be able to pre-order her book and get it as soon as possible because it's going to be epic. So without further ado, let's get into the episode.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Stick of Joseph channel. You might not recognize me. My name is Ella. I'm actually Hayden and Jackson's little sister. So they asked me to come help while they're out on deployment. So I'm really excited to be here. A little nervous being in front of the camera, but it'll be good. Today we have an awesome guest. Andrea Woodmansee is here, and we have Dave as well. But yeah, we're really excited to talk to her. She has an awesome topic that we're going to be talking about, and we're just really excited. So welcome, Andrea.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So what are we going to be talking about today?
So I thought that for today we would take a closer look at this scene that we have in Matthew 25. This is Jesus' famous parable of the 10 virgins. And we have the 5 wise and the 5 unwise. And it's such a familiar parable to us that I think sometimes we miss part of the message. Yeah. But there's this scene in this parable that I just find haunting. And it's where these 5 unwise virgins finally make it to the door of the wedding feast, and the door is shut, and they knock at the door. They want to come in. They've finally gone and gotten their oil. They have their stuff together now, and they're at the door, and that's not enough.
Yeah.
And the keeper of the door says, I know you not. And yeah, that's a tough one, right?
Yeah, just imagining what that would feel like to be one of those virgins.
Right. What that would have felt like. And you think about their position, especially when you put this entire parable into the context of these ancient Hebrew wedding traditions, they would have known about this wedding coming well in advance, possibly a year or more. Plenty of time to prepare. And they had been waiting. They were prepared. At one point, they did have the oil. They were there in the place they were supposed to be to wait for the bridegroom to come. And so you assume that they were looking forward to this event. They just ran out of the oil. So a lot of times we focus on, the oil. What was the oil? What does it represent? How do we make sure we have oil? But I think it's interesting that they were still able to go get oil in the parable.
Yeah.
So there's something else at play here. Let's actually turn there. Let's go to Matthew 25.
Do it.
And if we go to Matthew 25, verse 10, it says, while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and they that were ready went in with him to the marriage, and the door was shut. Afterward came also the other virgins, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. So it sounds to me like they were able to go obtain oil, whatever that represents, and they were able to make it to the wedding feast. So it seems like they're ready now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily the oil that's the dividing line between the wise virgins and the unwise virgins.
Yeah.
It's the knowing that's that dividing line. What do you think, Dave?
I think it's interesting that this seems to be a reflection of the scene in Matthew chapter 7, where some people are excluded from the Holy of Holies, and they say, "We've cast out devils in your name and done good works in your name," and he says, "I know you not."
Right.
It's not exactly the same language, but I think it's the same scene.
Right. I think it is the same scene. I think you're exactly right. So, and it's also interesting to note that part of getting into a wedding feast in ancient Hebrew customs was that you would have a tablet or a token or something to present at the door of the wedding feast.
Interesting.
By which the keeper of the door could recognize you.
Yeah.
So, because there was no wedding crashing back then.
Yeah. Sad.
So you come to the door, you present this tablet or a token or whatever it is, and with that you have access. You're recognized as someone who's been invited to this wedding, and you're welcome to come in and participate. When these 5 unwise virgins come to the door is already shut. The keeper of the door can no longer see, because you imagine these ancient doors are these big heavy things, and they have this wooden bar, this bolt that slides across to bar the door shut. And that's what it says in there, that the door was shut. It makes a point of saying the door was shut. So in ancient times, the only way to get around that, if you came to a closed door at someone's home, you would knock, and whoever came to answer the door, whether it was the master of the house or keeper of the door, would ask, who is it? And then you would say your name, but they didn't accept just your name as your identity, because then you could say the name. They had to also recognize the voice.
Oh.
And so what you have in this scene is the keeper of the door, who ostensibly is Christ in this parable, behind a shut door, asking when the 5 virgins arrive, who is it? They answer, and he says, I don't know you. I don't recognize your voice. And that's a little bit terrifying.
Yeah.
The dividing line between the wise virgins and the unwise virgins was not only that the wise virgins had prepared the oil and they were ready to go with the wedding procession. They were there on time. They had the tokens present, and they were there when the door was open, and they were recognized by the bridegroom.
Okay.
So the unwise virgins were not recognized. And that seems to be the real dividing line of being able to enter into the wedding feast or not. And we, like Dave said, we have the same scene plays out in other places in the scriptures, that the dividing line is knowing Christ and versus not knowing him. So let's go to Luke 13. Okay, so verse 23, this is Christ. He's with his disciples, and he says, then said one unto him, Lord, are there few that be saved? And he said unto them, strive to enter in at the straight gate. And if you remember, straight there means narrow. For many, I say unto you, will seek to enter in, and shall not be able. When once the master of the house is risen up, and hath shut to the door, and ye begin to stand without, and to knock at the door, saying, Lord, Lord, open unto us. And he shall answer and say unto you, I know not whence ye are. So that's the same scene as the parable of the 5 unwise virgins, really, where here are these people come to the door, it's been shut, and they say, open to us. And he says, I don't know who you are.
Yeah.
So there's something going on here with recognizing Christ and him recognizing us.
What would happen after that happened? Like once they were denied at the door, what would happen to them?
Great question. So let's flip back to Matthew 25. And Matthew 25 actually tells us this twice. So in verse 12, so he says, he answered and said, verily I say unto you, I know you not. So obviously he's not opening the door.
Yeah.
And Hebrew weddings took place at night traditionally. And so you imagine they come to the door, the wedding party has already gone in, and they were all carrying their lights into the wedding. And traditionally you would bring your oil lamp with you to the wedding, and then you have all these oil lamps lighting up the wedding, and it creates this really beautiful, wonderful, joyous scene for this wedding, right? If you're outside of that and it's night and the door is shut, you're out in the dark, right?
Oh, wow.
It's the darkness outside or the outer darkness.
Oh, wow. Oh, gosh.
So, and we see as much, he gives us this next parable. It's the parable of the talents. And so often we talk about the parable of the talents like it relates to our talents or the gifts God has given us, but there's more to it. And I think we see that when in verse 30, it says that this unwise servant who hasn't improved on his talents or produced fruit, he's cast. Okay, so verse 30, and cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So it's the same thing where this unprofitable servant is in the outer darkness, just like the 5 unwise virgins would have been left in the darkness outside.
So I'm looking at this passage in Luke, okay? And at the risk of sounding like a one-trick typological pony, so it's super interesting to me that in verse 24, the exhortation is strive to enter in at the straight gate. Like we're clearly again in the same scene. And one of the interesting things about the sort of Matthew 6 and 7, you see this in sort of other kinds of passages that are visualizing the same ascent, is there's this sort of ambiguity about where the meal is, right? Because on the one hand, it seems pretty clearly to be in the middle space in the second room. On the other hand, you're eating the fruit of the tree, which is in the third room, and there are a lot of passages that talk about coming into the final space to be eat meat and drink and honey and milk without price, right? Like there seems to be like a sort of a feasting promise associated with the third room, right? And that actually kind of seems to be what Luke is talking about in Luke 13. If we think about Luke 13 here in the context of what is described in the Sermon on the Mount, which I think is being clearly referenced in verse 24, strive to enter into the straight gate. That's the straight gate of straight is the gate and narrow is the way of Matthew 7. I think this gives an answer to a question that a whole series of a whole family of texts raises, or at least it corroborates what those texts say. So in the Sermon on the Mount, the feast is in Matthew 6. The feast is in the middle room of the temple. This is the same as we see in Exodus 24. The feast is in the second stage of the ascent, and then you come up to the third, through the straight and narrow gate to the third stage, right? Despite that, there are texts that talk about, I think 2 Nephi 9 is one of them, that say, hey, come to the feast as an invitation into the final space, okay? Milk and honey, meat and wine without price, that kind of language, which sort of always gives this ambiguity to the question of eating and like, where is the feast? Is it in the middle? Is it at the end? And I've always sort of thought, well, the answer in some sense has to be both, right? You have the feast in the middle, and it's emblematic of a sort of I think you probably don't actually eat in the third room, but it's sort of spiritually a feast. I think that's what we're being shown here, because the master of the house rejects these people, and they offer a defense, and they say, "We ate and drank in thy presence." Right? Are we not good enough for you? We already had a feast with you. You taught in our streets, and the answer is, I don't know you. I don't know where you're from. You are workers of iniquity, right? And I think what we're looking at here is texts that warn people that what they think is enough for salvation might not be enough for salvation.
Right.
And so this seems to be specifically, or it's using the language of that assent and saying, look, just because you feasted with the Lord in the second room does not mean that you get to pass the judgment.
Right.
Right. More is required.
Right. And I think it maps, your interpretation really maps onto the Hebrew wedding customs, because there's not just one meal.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
So, because, and I wonder, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, this passage in Luke 13 where they're saying, we have eaten and drunk in thy presence. We've done the things you asked us to do. Now, putting that into this wedding context, the bride and groom would come together at their betrothal, and they would share a covenantal meal.
Oh.
And
prior to the wedding.
Prior to the wedding feast.
Yeah.
And so the groom would actually they would share some bread, and we still have this phrase in our jargon is, you break bread together. Well, what does it mean to break bread together?
Yeah.
It actually, they would use it anciently as a custom for establishing kinship.
Interesting.
And I mean, you even see this back as far as Abraham. He invites these random strangers into his tent, and they break bread together.
Yeah.
He feeds them. So they would do this as part of this wedding ceremony to show that we're joining these two families together into kinship. So we're going to break bread together, and then the bridegroom would pour a glass of wine and set it before the bride, the potential bride. And if she agrees to this arrangement, she drinks the cup of wine. And so it's really a covenantal meal. And at that point, they're considered married. It's done. Even though they haven't had the formal wedding ceremony yet, they are now as good as married.
Yeah.
Now, at this point, of course, they separate, and they have this period of separation where they prepare for the big wedding feast yet to come, which is the scene that we get in the 10 virgins. But might there be 2 covenantal meals?
Yeah, interesting.
And I wonder, this is just postulating here.
Yeah.
If this passage in Luke 13 might map onto what we see as the sacrament. We've eaten and drunk in thy presence.
Yeah.
We've had the bread. We've had the wine. We made those baptismal covenants.
Yeah.
That's akin to this betrothal.
Yeah.
Where, you are now part of that covenant. You're in the covenant.
Yeah.
But there's more. And so just being in the covenant, just showing up to church on Sunday, taking the sacrament as rote practice, might not be enough. And I wonder if that's what Christ in this parable is telling them. Like, you could, you've been waiting, you've been anticipating this, you've been invited, you can even run out and buy the oil at the last minute and still make it to the door.
Yeah.
But it's not enough. I didn't know you. Or as Joseph Smith puts it in Joseph Smith Matthew, is you never knew me.
Yeah. So that's super interesting that you had that thought. So I had a thought that is oblique, but I think maybe interestingly consistent. I recently read W. Robertson Smith's Lectures on the Religion of the Semites.
Of course you did.
Ella and I were reading it together. It's book club buddies. Overdue. I should have read this a long time ago. But one of the things he describes is that in the so he's talking about Semites is not just Jews. In fact, a lot of the research he's talking about is dealing with Arab texts, and I don't know if the word anthropology was even used when he was writing, but basically anthropology in kind of Arab lands. But he says that the animals that belong to the family are not really animals; they are kin. And so whenever the family eats one of the family animals, it is a solemn, serious sacrificial act, right? That's not just a goat like you would go and buy a slab of goat meat down at the Kroger.
Right.
It is like that was a member of our family, right?
So it was a real sacrifice.
It was a real sacrifice in every sense, right? We no longer have the goat's milk, but also like it is a holy act, right? This is one of the innovations of Deuteronomy is it separates eating from sacrifice, maybe for the first time in the history of the Hebrews. So if the sort of a betrothal meal is two families together and and we're eating not just bread, but if we're eating like one of our animals, right? We're eating, we slaughter a bull or something, right?
Right.
It has that kind of a connotation of, because by the way, who else Robertson Smith would say is one of our kinsfolk is our God. He is also in the same kinship group, right? And so the fact of the act of eating one of our animals together is a very strong statement of this is the same family. We are the same
So interesting.
people now, and very much has kind of echoes in the space of eating the flesh and blood of the Lord. Our great Goel, our great kinsman.
Right. He is that great kinsman, and he is the great sacrifice.
Yeah.
That he's not just the animal sacrifice. He is the sacrifice, and he is also the bridegroom.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Super interesting.
yeah, a lot of layers of symbolism there.
Wow.
So, and like you mentioned, Dave, we see that same scene unfold in Matthew chapter 7. This is the end of the Sermon on the Mount, or maybe it's the middle.
It's the end.
It's the end. Okay. Matthew 7. And as Dave has so well taught us,
I'm sorry I got out ahead of you.
no, on many occasions, and it's great. I recommend all of your videos. That this Sermon on the Mount, and it's funny because I remember studying this in seminary growing up, the Sermon on the Mount, and it just seemed like this hodgepodge collection of sayings.
Yeah. Most quotes.
Right. Just nice quotes. It sounds good. As far as sermons go, I'm not sure it's that great.
Yeah.
Until you grasp that unifying theme that this is an ordinance and it takes place in a temple context. Suddenly it opens up.
Yeah.
And so I think understanding that there's a temple context behind this sermon makes so much sense. In chapter 7, verse 7, he says, "Ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you." Right? We know this promise. Those 5 unwise virgins knocked.
Yeah. Where's the disconnect?
Yeah.
Oof.
And that's why I think that this dividing line that he's teaching us in the parable of the 10 virgins is the knowing. It's the knowing him that's so key. So then still in Matthew 7, if you go to verse 21, that's where he takes us a step further from the asking, seeking, knocking to, "Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven." So there's a doing that has to happen. It's not just showing up. Showing up isn't enough. And in fact, if you continue down in these verses, like Dave was saying in 22, "Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name have done many wonderful works?" So they're saying, why are you not allowing us in? We've done all these great, spectacular, wonderful things. Because he says, you have to do the will of my Father. And they're saying, well, we did. We prophesied. We cast out devils. I mean, that's some pretty impressive stuff, honestly. So, and then he says, "And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity." So it just leaves me wondering, what is going on here? Because he says, ask, seek, knock. Okay, they do that. And he says, well, not everybody that knocks can come in. Only the ones that do the will of my Father. And they say, yeah, we did the will. We prophesied. We cast out devils. We did all these things. And he says,
not good enough.
Still not. And it's a little bit terrifying.
Yeah.
I think it should call us to attention. And I know in our day and age, we don't like to be called out or to think that Jesus isn't always just there to just love and accept us and welcome us home. Certainly there's that mercy side, but there's also this side where there are certain expectations. And this doesn't diminish his grace or his mercy at all. It's just saying you have to be prepared to enter here. And if you don't know me on a real level, you are not prepared. So this is more than just showing up to take the sacrament on Sunday. This is more than having your name on the records of the church. This is more than even just going through the temple. This is creating an I hate to say relationship because that's used very casually in our day too. Oh, we have a relationship with Jesus. This is a covenantal relationship. that has to be built. This is why we have that covenant meal in the beginning, where we take the bread, we take the wine. And if you think about it, when you take the sacrament, you know, yes, it symbolizes Christ. It symbolizes that bread of life coming into us, his blood coming into us. He is in us, through us, and we become entirely identified with him.
Wow.
And that's, I think, what it takes, is being so close to him that he recognizes us, because he sees himself in us. And so it's not completing a checklist of ordinances. It's not completing a checklist of good deeds. It's about who we are becoming. Mm-hmm. And that's how we come to know him. So, and this passage in Matthew 7 ends interestingly, because he says, I'll tell you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity. And then he kind of gives them the answer to this problem. And the answer is, therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken to a wise man which built his house upon a rock. To me, that's a really loaded verse. So, first of all, you have to hear these sayings of his. What sayings? I mean, I would assume it's the Sermon on the Mount that he just gave. You have to hear what he's actually teaching here, and hear it in a way that you're listening. It's becoming part of you, you're understanding, and then you have to act on those things. You have to make the covenant. You have to make the assent, basically. And then we have wisdom in there. A wise man, this sounds like the wise virgins, right? There's something going on with wisdom. And then where does the wise man build his house? It's on a rock. Well, why? Is it just because it provides a firmer foundation, or is there something more to the rock?
I have never noticed, way back in verse, 7, everyone who asks receiveth. So the verb, I don't know how I missed this until this very minute, but the verb receiveth is lambane, which is, lambano is, the basic meaning of lambano is to take into your hands. So it's anyone who asks graspeth would be another translation, which I don't know how many times I've read this in Greek, and I've never noticed that until just now, because I am slow. It's super interesting. So I'm looking at this, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them. Hans-Dieter Betz in his commentary talks about this verse and says, this tells us that the Sermon on the Mount was delivered verbally, that it was a text, but that it was, most people heard it. Mm-hmm. They did in the first instance. Eventually it became a written book, right? But people heard it. Also, I think it suggests that the Sermon on the Mount is something that you do. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing to me that, again, I'm noticing for the first time is the verb to do here is poieo. It's not prato. Prato is you do or you make. Poieo is to create. It's the word that poet comes from, right? In the beginning, I'm pretty sure, I'll double check this. I think it's Genesis 1:1 in the Greek Old Testament. Hotheos epoiesen, the heaven and the earth, right? So there's this interesting echo, enarche epoiesen hotheos. So it's the verb of creation. Mm-hmm. So it feels to me like there's a lot of layers here. One, we have this hint that this is not just a text, that it's more than a text, that is a thing that is spoken and heard and also performed. I think the performance is connected with creation, and I think on the one hand, sort of that is maybe that is the umpteenth connection here with the Eden story, with the creation story, and that this sort of hint that the worshiper has to become a creator, right? Has to create these things. You have to hear these things, and then you have to also create them.
Right. And it even tells you there what he's creating.
Tell me what you're thinking about.
I will liken him unto a wise man. Where do we go to get wisdom?
Yeah.
Which built his house. What is a house? Is it just a structure we live in? You think of the house of Israel.
Sure. Or Kings refers to each room of Solomon's temple as a house.
Uh-huh.
So this is a house built upon the rock.
Right.
Is the kingdom of God.
And a rock. Is this any old rock?
No, I am on record as saying this is not any old rock. This is obviously the foundation stone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting, right? So because one way to come out of reading the parable would be to say, this is about timing, right? You have to do the will of the Father, but or my will, but that's time dependent, right? I needed you to do it then, not now.
Right.
Doing it now, it's too late. For me, the sort of darkest word in this whole rejection in Matthew 7 is never. I never knew you. Udepote, I never knew you. While you were casting out devils, while you were prophesying in the name of Jesus, while you were doing many wonderful works, I did not know you even then.
Yeah.
Right? It's not these people did wonderful things and they sinned and fell away. It's that whatever, like they were doing these things in the name of Jesus, and he didn't know them then. I don't know where we end up with this though. How do we sum all this up?
I think the call here is to make sure that we know him in the sense that the scriptures teach knowing. And it's interesting to look at that. The scriptures tell us, actually. So clearly here in Matthew 7:21, he says, you have to do the will of my Father. You can only enter into the kingdom by doing the will of the Father. Okay, so there's that one. Now turn over to 1 John chapter 2.
Oh, hello. Plot twist.
Yes. He says, and hereby we do know that we know him. Here's how we know that we know him. If we keep his commandments. He that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him.
That's interesting. And so one of the things this connects to is your JST reading of Matthew, where the issue was not that the bridegroom knows the virgin. The issue is, does the virgin know the bridegroom? Right.
Right. Because it's in doing those, in keeping those commandments and doing the will of the Father that we come to know him. And continues here, John continues over in verses 9 and 10, and you'll see this theme of dark and light that kind of echoes the parable of the virgins as well. He says, he that saith he is in the light and hateth his brother is in darkness even until now. He that loveth his brother abideth in the light, and there is none occasion of stumbling in him. But he that hateth his brother is in darkness, and walketh in darkness, and knoweth not whither he goeth, because that darkness hath blinded his eyes. So, John's telling us, if you know him, if you're keeping the commandments, you know him. If you're doing the will of the Father, you know him. If you are loving your brother, you're in the light. Is that enough to just... we sing songs in primary about keeping the commandments, right? What are the commandments, though? What are they, and how do we keep them? Like, do we ever think about that? We're just like, I think often in the church we assume that keeping the commandments means like, don't drink, don't smoke, obey the law of chastity, those kinds of things. Yeah. But there's something deeper here, and I think John hints at it where he says, "He that loveth his brother abideth in light." And it goes to these two great commandments that Christ taught, right? That first you love God, and then you love yourself, or love your neighbor as yourself. So, but this isn't just any love. This is a sacrificial love. In Matthew 22, Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind."
What verse are you in?
Matthew 22, verse 37.
37.
So these are the two great commandments.
Okay.
So it's easy to say, I love God, but what kind of love is this? How do we truly love God? How do we come to know him And is there a relationship between knowing him and loving him?
Well, this is the verb love here is the same one that's used in 1 John. It's agapao, right? So John 2:10, ho agapon, the one loving his brother is in the light. And that's the language here. Agapeses, the Lord your God, and then agapeses ton plesion soy, your neighbor as yourself, hoseoton. That's interesting. So do you think then, I mean, maybe that's it, right? Maybe some of what we're hearing in Matthew 7 is, look, don't get distracted by the drama. You are not here on earth to cast out devils and work wonders and do these things, prophesy. Maybe you are, but that's not what gets you in the door.
Right.
What gets you in the door is the agape, the quiet, the love, the selfless love you feel, or you show to your neighbor and to God.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the beauty of the Hebrew wedding model. These traditions is it shows us that kind of love is akin to a husband and a wife, where it's covenantal, it's committed, it's loyal, it says all your heart, your soul, your mind, like everything is on God. It's not a Sunday thing. It's not when I go to the temple thing. It infuses your entire being, and it's a state of heart.
Yeah.
Rather than it's who we've become. And I think that's what Christ is teaching us in this parable, that you can bring the oil, you can show up at the door, but I'll go to this one. Let's go to Alma 5. And about verse 10, he says, "And now I ask of you, on what conditions are you saved?" Like how are you saved? What is required? And verse 12, he says, according to his faith, there was a mighty change wrought in his heart. Continuing on, verse 14, this is a famous one we all know. "And now, behold, I ask of you, my brethren of the church, have ye spiritually been born of God? Have you received his image in your countenances? Have you experienced this mighty change in your hearts?" So that's a familiar verse. So familiar, I think sometimes we skim over it. But what does that mean to have his image in your countenance?
So your countenance is your face. So image, of course, this is the Book of Mormon, so we have to guess what's underneath this. But in the King James, in the image of God is male and female, man is made, right? So again, I think we have a text that's hearkening back to the creation, right? It's interesting that it's visual. Have you received his image in your countenance? Do you because it feels like it's saying, do you visibly look
like him,
look like God? Yeah.
And I wonder if you pair that with the scene of these virgins standing at the door.
Yeah.
And he's looking at them and he says, "I don't know you. I don't recognize you because
interesting.
You don't have my image in your countenance. Sure, you've done all the things, but you haven't become like him."
Which may be like the preceding sentence, right? Have you been born of God?
Exactly.
So this is like, maybe that's the idea is, look, the idea is to be born of God. To be born, you carry a family resemblance, right, from your parents. And maybe that's the image. If you were born of God, people would see it. They'd look on you, and it would be in your countenance.
Right.
You would look like God created you in God's image.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that might be what he's not seeing at that door with those 5 unwise virgins.
Yeah. Wow.
So then we'll just take a look at this one, Mosiah chapter 5, because I think it's interesting to see how some of these themes crop up in the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith was pretty creative when he came up with this, wasn't he?
Clever boy. They used to do this. They'd sit around and they'd cut trees and they'd just make up books.
Right. That could interweave all these ancient themes. And
yeah. You see the Muslim ones. They're really good.
Okay, so Mosiah 5.
We're late in King Benjamin's address.
Yes, this is King Benjamin's address. Mosiah 5:13. For how knoweth a man the master whom he has not served, and who is a stranger unto him, and is far from the thoughts and intents of his heart. And so I think when we put that in the wedding context, you think of this bride or these 10 virgins who have been waiting for maybe a year for this wedding to take place. They've been promised, they've been covenanted. They've signed the contract. They're as good as married. They're just waiting for the actual wedding ceremony to take place. And I picture 5 of these brides being very excited about this. Yeah. They can't wait to meet the bridegroom. They look forward to that day, and they are orienting their lives and striving to become someone worthy of being in his presence. Whereas these other 5, they showed up, they brought the oil, they did the things, but maybe the bridegroom was far from the thoughts and intents of their heart. Maybe they were just in the place, but the bridegroom wasn't in their heart. I don't know if that distinction makes sense, but that love for God has to be deep in our hearts. And I think when it is, that's when it is in our countenance.
Yeah.
And
it was reminding me a lot of Moroni 7 when it's talking about charity in verse 48, and it just says, wherefore, my beloved brethren, pray unto the Father with all the energy of heart, that ye may be filled with this love which he hath bestowed upon all who are true followers of his Son Jesus Christ, that ye may become the sons of God, that when he shall appear we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is, that we may have this hope, that we may be purified even as he is pure. Amen.
Perfect. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's it right there. That it's not, we need to do the things. We need to keep the commandments. We need to enter into this covenant relationship. And ultimately the goal of that, of doing all those things, isn't just to do them.
Yeah.
It's to receive his image in our countenance and like this, so that when he shall appear, we shall be like him. So that he does recognize us. And I think that's what we're shooting for.
Yeah, I agree.
Anything to add?
No, I think that's great. I was thinking about the Oscar Wilde novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and how there's an idea that Dorian's sins, his great immoralities, would show upon his face. They don't, because instead he has this sort of magical picture that absorbs them. So the final reveal, we see the painting of Dorian Gray, and like every act of wickedness is in the face of the painting, right? It's sort of that same idea that that if you are filled with the love that you should be filled with, that it will be visible in your face, and that's what it is. It's interesting to me. 2 Nephi 9:41 is, I think, tells us. I mean, there's a lot going on in 2 Nephi 9:41, but one of the things it says, this is Jacob talking about meeting the Lord at the gate. Some of that same story is this is clearly a recognition scene. The keeper of the gate is the Holy One of Israel. He employeth no servant there. There is none other way save it be by the gate. He cannot be deceived, for the Lord God is his name. Now, I think what that actually means, I've said this elsewhere, is the Lord God is his name. We're in a passage that references the Eden story a lot. I think what this is literally saying is he is the same being, the Lord God, who oversaw the Garden of Eden and who booted you out at the fall. And he is still there waiting, right? Which means that it is not a matter of going to strangers to have a test applied to you, right? It is a matter of going back to the gate to be recognized as a returning family.
Yes.
Right. And so how do I get the countenance of God in my face? By having the love of God in my heart. And that is the fundamental test I think you are teaching us.
Right.
Not how many demons did I cast out, etc.
Yeah.
I think that's lovely.
It's who have we become and are we part of?
Yeah.
Have we become part of the family?
Yeah. I think that's fantastic.
So, there you go.
Awesome. Well, it was so good to hear from Andrea and talk with her about knowing Christ and becoming more like him. We're grateful for her, and just remember to do your best and remember who you are and stay hungry and curious. Thanks so much. Bye.